Just another Mishnah Monday over here. Good to see you all. It is just another, but it is the first in a long, long time. We are back. This is like, if you haven't been with us before, let me just tell you, we got a history here. We did this for about a year in the heart of deep pandemic, and we had this class at this time, the Mishnah class, and I'll say a little bit more about what it is that we did and what it is that that Mishnah is. But we had it in part because I, during the pandemic, found Mishnah study to be one of the things that brought me the greatest comfort. It's like sort of a strange thing, but it brought me a great comfort because I think now, looking back, the study of Mishnah is really the attempt to envision an entire world, an entire civilization. And maybe being stuck inside, it was nice to explore a world through books. But that's what the Mishnah is. It is the attempt of the rabbis to map out their whole society, So a little background on that. The Mishnah is recorded at the beginning of the 3rd century. So let's say like 220 of the Common Era, and it is recorded just about a century after the Great Temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. That's a big pivot moment in Jewish history, because when the temple was destroyed for the second time, it had been destroyed before, and somehow they managed to rebuild. But in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Romans destroyed the temple, and it seemed like Jewish civilization was over. It just seemed like that's it. That's the end, because the temple was the center of the spiritual center of a whole society, of a whole state, a whole functioning Jewish civilization in the land of Israel. It seemed like that was over. Exile, temple destroyed, no more Judaism. There's just no way to practice anymore. And the rabbis, and sometimes we'll say the rabbis, and when I say the rabbis, I'm not just referring to all rabbis, but to the movement during that period that we came to call Rabbinic Judaism, that proposed that we could continue Judaism through the study of our Torah and the practice of its laws. Now, I say we could. They proposed as if that never existed before, and that's not true. Though these laws were already a part of our society, but and these sacred texts were in our canon already, in our possession already. But the radical, the new, the kind of Jewish revolution that took place around this time was the idea that these laws, the practice of these halacha, we came to call it, which means the way. These laws form a way of living, and that way of living can be practiced anywhere, studied anywhere, practiced anywhere. You can keep Judaism going through the practice of its laws. You don't need a land, you don't need a temple, you don't need a whole society. And that's all very quick oversimplification, but what is true about it is that there's just a major transition point around this time. And what the Mishnah represents is the first attempt to record what those laws and practices are. In fact, there was a long tradition of not recording those laws and practices. There was an idea that we had the Torah, the written Torah, and then we had what was called the oral Torah. At least that's what the rabbis told us, that there was another tradition that was oral, that we passed on from generation to generation and never wrote down. And that tradition was an explanation of the Torah, how to practice the Torah, how the Torah was to be understood, and what extra laws were to be derived from the Torah, or even to the new laws that would support the practice of the Torah. But all of that was referred to as the oral tradition, and we weren't even supposed to write it down. So the Mishnah, even as it saves Judaism, is in violation of a central principle of this society, which is that the way, the halakha, the practice, was something that was passed on from generation to generation and never written down. It is written down in around the year 220 because there's simply a fear that this, now in the wake of the Great Destruction, all of this knowledge is going to be lost. Okay, so the Mishnah is this attempt to kind of map out all the practices that make up a whole society. And for that reason, I really feel like, and I'm teaching this class in part because Mishnah is the best way to get core Jewish knowledge. Study of Mishnah is like, I would call it like crunchy Jewish knowledge, like the nuts and bolts, the intricacies of everything in this society, everything. I mean, the Mishnah is organized into 6 categories, six orders of the Mishnah. And the first one's agriculture. So like everything that all the agricultural practices of this society. And the second order of the Mishnah is holidays. So all discussions of all of the holidays and all the ritual practices. Okay. And then there's family law, and then there's damages and property law, and then there's laws of purity and impurity, and then finally laws of the temple. They recorded those as well, although purity and impurity and laws of the temple, the last 2 orders of the Mishnah, those are an attempt to record the practices of the temple, but because there is no temple, those are the least studied and they feel like the least relevant. So where are we in all of that? Well, what we did is studied together for about a year, and we moved through the first order, the agricultural laws of the Mishnah. And we were just starting the holiday laws, Moed, Seder Moed, it's called, all of the holidays. So that's where we're at. And we took a break for the summer, and then we never came back because there was a demand for all kinds of other classes, and scheduling reasons, the Mishnah class went dark for the last year. And I'm so happy to revive it. I really think that this is, as I said, the best way to build core Jewish knowledge. There is one other great way to build that kind of, meat and potatoes, eat your vegetables kind of Jewish knowledge. There's one other great way to do that, and that is through the study of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which is a work written much, much later. And Maimonides' Mishnah Torah is an attempt to summarize the entire Talmud in very clear and concise language, so that, he says, and he gets in a lot of trouble for it, you don't even have to read the Talmud, just read my book. And Maimonides is right. If you just read through Maimonides' book, you will get a very clear, a very straightforward, a very, again, nuts and bolts Judaism. But it's not as much fun studying the Mishnah Torah, even though it's a masterpiece. But it's not as much fun. And it's not as much fun for a couple of reasons. One is it's all Maimonides. And so he is giving you his interpretation is just one interpretation. We're actually going to hear from Maimonides today. That's just one interpretation, whereas the Mishnah, like the Talmud, records debates and a diversity of opinion. And all of that is also to say that the study of the Mishnah is also the best introduction to the study of the classic form of study in Judaism, which is the study of the Talmud. In fact, the Talmud is made up of 2 parts: the Mishnah, that's the earlier part, and then the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah. And we'll see that today. So part of what we're doing here is we're getting an introduction to Talmud study, which is a classic form of Jewish study. But but we're always going to stay. Our method here is we're going to stay in the study of the Mishnah, that first layer, because it's good. It gives us a good, by moving through the Talmud takes 7 years, 7.5 years to get through. If you studied it assiduously every single day, 1 page a day, front and back, that's a lot of work in itself. To study 1 page of Talmud could take you a whole year in itself, right? Very dense, very intricate, very deep form of study, but the Mishnah allows us to move a little bit faster. We'll see Talmud as we move through it, but our method when we did this last time was to try and get an overview of everything that was happening in the Mishnah without getting too caught up in the intricacies and the details, because this is intricate stuff. So what I'm doing and what I have done in the past is to move through the Mishnah in order, but not to look at every single Mishnah. We're just looking at the highlights, some of the most important or most interesting Mishnayot, that's the plural, that come up. And we're going to do that today. So this is the last sort of introductory thing I'll say, which is that the Mishnah allows us to see some of the central, hallmark, most important Jewish teachings. And then it also allows us, because of the way the Mishnah is presented, it allows us to take kind of detours and tangents and to get kind of caught up in side conversations and side topics, things that come up along the way, because the Mishnah and the Talmud is written like a conversation, as opposed to Maimonides' code of law. The Mishnah, it's a code, it's the first rabbinic code, but it's a code that has all kinds of voices in it and all kinds of, and it's a code that's willing to take a tangent. Something comes up and then all of a sudden, oh, let's talk about that for a while. And so that's what we're going to do today. Today, we're going to take a look at a very, very central and crucial piece of Jewish knowledge, which is the laws, the prohibited actions on Shabbat, the practice of Shabbat. How do we practice Shabbat? What are we not allowed to do? How do we rest on Shabbat? So that's core Jewish knowledge. But today, we're also going to something's going to come up along the way, and we're going to allow ourselves to get distracted, to take a tangent, and the tangent is going to take us into another fascinating discussion, a discussion about anger and debates about the role that anger plays in our life, in our consciousness, whether it has any value or not. These questions we're going to raise also. So I hope if you're here for that core Jewish knowledge, I hope you'll get a sense of how core this is. And if you're here just checking it out, I hope that the conversation around anger will give you a sense of all kinds of other fascinating conversations that arise once we begin the study of Mishnah. Today's conversation will take us into the realm of psychology, but I think that Mishnah allows for these sorts of tangents because Mishnah is a kind of here's a $10 word for you. I think what the Mishnah does is a kind of ontology. Ontology meaning like the study of reality, of being, of that which is. And when I say that, I mean the Mishnah is very willing to ask questions about everything in its reality. So if if the Mishnah mentions filling a cup up, then the Mishnah might ask, well, what is a cup? I mean, how do we define a cup? And what does it mean to fill? What is the action of filling? What does it mean to drink? What constitutes drinking? Is a sip drinking? So it's that kind of conversation. Let's really drill down and figure out what the essence of everything around us is, and let's debate that. Okay? So that's all by way of introduction. I will just tell you that if you have not been with us, you can catch up on, or at least check out what we've done in the past, because here, let me show you on our website here. We have a whole history of the journey of Mishnah that we've gone through before, where we these are all classes on the Mishnah, and you can take a look at them here. And then that takes us to, where were we when we left off? Which I said already, we were at the beginning of the second order of the Mishnah, which is the laws of the holidays. And the first tractate of the Mishnah, Masechet they call it, first tractate of the Mishnah, covers the most important Jewish holiday, Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat. And we did some classes on that already, and I'm just gonna remind us of the very last class that we did, because that'll take us into the material for today. But first, I've been talking long enough. Let's say a blessing, and then we'll get into our study for today. So this is a blessing over Torah study, and grateful to be starting this new cycle again with you all. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, the last class that we managed to have was one that that dealt with a very, very, very important Mishnah. Here, I'll actually give you the YouTube link if you want to take a look at it. But a very, very important Mishnah in the laws of Shabbat, and that Mishnah is it'll be relevant to us today. So here's a YouTube link to the class that we did before, and here is. Sorry, it's not going to usually be this much introduction, but this is our first class in a while, so I'm taking a long running start here. One other link that I want to give you before we begin our study today, which is, this is the source sheet for the class we did, and in that source sheet, we took a look. In that class, we took a look at a very, very important Mishnah. Mishnah just means teaching, but every one of the sections, every one of the Mishnah is divided into chapters, and each chapter is made up of a certain amount of Mishnayot, and each teaching is one Mishnah. And this Mishnah that we saw last time gave us the 39 prohibited labors of Shabbat. Okay, you are supposed to rest on Shabbat, and the question is, how do you do that? How do you rest on Shabbat? And finally, we're 7 chapters in, and all of a sudden the Mishnah says, well, let's list all of the prohibited labors on Shabbat. This is how you rest on Shabbat. You don't do these things. So you don't sow and plow and reap and gather and thresh, all these agricultural things you don't do. You don't bake, okay? You don't shear wool and whiten it and comb it and dye it. Now, where do they get this list from, all these 39 things? These labors, and we covered this in the last class, now over a year ago, but these labors are derived from what kind of work was necessary in order to build the tabernacle, the portable temple in the desert. So you had to chop things, and you had to grow things, and you had to cook things. The whole running of the tabernacle, the portable temple, became the source for, well, that's work. That's, in fact, the most explicit work that the Torah talks about, is the construction of this tabernacle. So whatever they had to do to construct that tabernacle, we can't do on Shabbat. That's why that is. You can see more about in that last class that I just put into the chat. But the point is, there are 39 things that they come up with that you cannot do. Okay, for our purposes today, the list is 39 long, but we're going to pick up on just one of those things that you cannot do, and that is here at the bottom, one who weaves 2 threads together and one who severs 2 threads. Okay, so weaving and sewing is prohibited on Shabbat. You can't stitch something on Shabbat. You can't knit on Shabbat. You can't fix a hole on Shabbat by sewing it together. Okay, because weaving fabrics was one of the things that they did in order to build the tabernacle. Okay, that's That's straightforward enough. That Mishnah in that we studied last time in chapter 7 that lists the 39 prohibited labors. That Mishnah gives us all the 39, and then pretty much the rest of Masechet Shabbat, of Tractate Shabbat. Pretty much the rest of it is a discussion of all of those 39 labors, and the rabbi's trying to figure out, okay, you can't do that, so what does it mean to plow? What does it mean to knit? Exactly what I said, ontology. What exactly is this? Let's figure out what the action of writing is. Is one letter writing, or do you have to write 2 letters in order to be writing? It's that kind of discussion. Okay, so today we're going to start by asking, what does it mean to weave, or what does it mean to knit? Okay. I've just said a lot. So let me just pause there, and I see already Robert's got a question. So let's see if there are any questions now that I just did a big dump to introduce us to the whole topic, and then we'll get into our learning. Robert, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about for a long time, which is that the Mishnah, the way it's written in the Gemara, they're very, very different than the writings you find in the first and second temple. And I've thought for a long time that maybe this, I mean, of course, we have this tradition that it's an oral tradition, it's not written down, okay. But also you brought up the whole idea of ontology, which is a Greek kind of idea. And I've often thought that maybe the reason the Mishnah, part of the reason the Mishnah was written down is because we're getting these influences from the Greeks and the Romans, and we have to consolidate our own way of life in competition with that culture out there, that they have their own way of thinking, their own philosophy, their own way of administering justice. And so in competition with them, we have to create our own. And even the idea of, well, what does it mean to drink? That sounds like a very Greek question. When you read Greek philosophy, they ask those kind of strange kind of questions. So I wanted to see your take on that and see if you see it that way, that the creation of the Mishnah is a way for us to kind of consolidate our own culture when we've got these competing cultures out there that are pressing against us.
Okay, that's very incisive comments there. Very lot of implications that could be that we could tease out for the rest of our time, and we won't. But I will say that Robert is right to suggest that. Let me start with the most basic thing that Robert said, which is that this is different than anything we've seen before in Jewish textual tradition. This looks different. The Mishnah, if nothing else, represents a whole new era of production and a whole new writing style, a whole new approach. The earliest record of Jewish literature is what we call the Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah, and the style of the writing in the Bible is quite different than what we see in the Mishnah. Now, why that is, I mean, fascinating suggestions that Robert gives us, and others have spoken about the way that yes, Rome was the conqueror, but also a tremendous influence in being a very legalistic culture, and before that, Greek culture having a tremendous influence on the region and the zeitgeist, the way of thinking. Not enough time to think about all of that today, but yes, that is worth thinking about, and surely there is some influence. But the most important thing for our purposes today is that this is like the second great era of productivity in Jewish history. So the whole of our Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is like the first era, and the Mishnah represents what will become the next great era of Jewish writing and thought, which will result in the Talmud, which will result in the Midrash. So this is the beginning of something that stretches through on through the 7th century, and it is quite distinct than what's come before it. So yes, let's keep thinking about that. But for our purposes, it's good to note that what we're looking at is like, if the Torah is the most the most important Jewish book, and the Talmud has become like the second most, or the second most studied, or maybe sometimes the most studied, it's because that was one era, and this is now a whole new era. Okay, Yael?
Well, when I was learning this, living in an Orthodox community in Jerusalem, I found these applications of the laws in the Torah. It's how do we apply those to our everyday life? And it was a theme to me, and the theme that helped me try to understand how these laws of Shabbat are related to each other is, imagine that you're a guest and that you leave no footprint. So it helped me very much. And I remember learning that we couldn't even braid our hair on Shabbat because it was like you were saying, the knitting and all of these things. So what does God do in the world, and what do we do? And this takes it to the point where we're tiptoeing through God's world, not interfering with a blade of grass. And then we kind of grasp, oh, I see. God gives us and runs the world, and we are a guest. We act as though we control it during the week, but on Shabbat we realize again each week who we are and what we're here for.
Okay, great. So Yael takes us now into the heart of our conversation, because one of the big questions that we're going to be asking today, the explicit question of the day, is what does it mean to observe Shabbat? What does it mean to not violate Shabbat? What constitutes the proper observance of Shabbat? That's the explicit question. And then, as I said, as we'll soon see, there's a kind of there's a question between the lines here, which we'll get to eventually, sort of a surprising question, which is how anger or other extreme emotional states might affect that observance. Okay, but Yael is bringing us to that first question. What does it mean to think about this careful observance, not committing any of these 39 labors? Why? What is going on there? And as we head in, we'll be able to ask that question. I think we'll be able to ask and answer that question just as we consider this one example. And as I said, the example is weaving and sewing. We're going to look at both. Okay, so here is our source sheet for today, and we're taking a look at a Mishnah in the middle of Tractate Shabbat. Tractate Shabbat is one of the longest in the whole, because Shabbat is such a big topic, in the whole of the Mishnah. It's 24 chapters, and this is in the 13th chapter. Okay, so I said there are 39 prohibited labors. We're just going to look at a couple of them. So Rabbi Eliezer, here's the beginning of chapter 13, and this the third Mishnah is the one we're going to spend most of our time with. But Rabbi Eliezer says that one who weaves 3 new threads or 1 additional thread is liable, and the rabbis say 2 threads either way. Okay, so that's the kind of, this is very, like, if you just read that out of context, it's like it's very difficult to decipher what exactly they're talking about. And the commentaries and the Talmud itself will try to unpack this. But for our purpose today, I'll just speak it out. Rabbi Eliezer's position is, if you're weaving something, then you're not allowed to weave on Shabbat. So when do you get to the point where you're actually committing the act of weaving? Well, I'm not a weaver here, but I do see Bobby Thompson is on our call, and Bobby has done stitching and knitting and weaving groups in our community. So I'll be really excited to see what her comments and anyone else who knows more about this than me. But on some basic level, if you weave 3 threads together, you've committed an act of weaving. Or, says Rabbi Eliezer, if there's already a fabric and you just add one thread, that's also an act of weaving. Okay, so if you're starting from scratch, you need to weave 3 threads in order to show that you've now begun the act of weaving. But if there's already a fabric, then any new weaving you do on it is weaving. Okay, now the other opinion, and I said there is a debate, is no, it's not 3 in 1. Let's just say it's 2 threads in any case, whether you're starting a fabric or whether you're adding to a fabric, 2 new threads anytime you have 2. So theoretically, what that means is you could add 1. So rabbis say 2 threads either way. What that means is you could add 1 thread to a garment, and that you're not really supposed to do that, but you're not liable. Now, what does it mean, liable? This is language that the Mishnah is going to use, even though it's not it's kind of funny. It's not really relevant. What are you liable for? You're liable to bring an offering, a sin offering. Okay, that's the rabbis are using the kind of punishment or a consequent scheme given by the Torah, which is that if you violated one of the laws of the Torah, you would bring a sin offering. Okay, so when they say liable, they mean
not liable for the death penalty, though.
It could also be the death penalty, and that would depend on whether you were doing it accidentally or on purpose. Correct. One of those 2 things. Either you bring an offering or capital punishment, because Shabbat merits capital punishment. So that depends on whether you did it on purpose or accidentally. Good question. Okay, so liable meaning you now suffer a consequence. You now suffer some kind of consequence. And if you only did 1 thread, you don't incur that punishment. Okay, so that's what constitutes weaving on Shabbat, or at least the violation of weaving on Shabbat. Okay, and then that's weaving, and then there's sewing. So weaving is creating a garment, sewing is fixing a garment, and the next Mishnah teaches us that if you sew 2 stitches, you're liable. That is, you like 1 thread through and then 2 thread through. Now you're liable. If you just did it 1 time, you haven't yet committed an act of sewing. Okay. All right. Now the Mishnah says something which is interesting in itself, but will soon bring us to the question of anger, which seems to have so far nothing to do with all of this, which is the Mishnah says, if you sew 2 stitches, you're liable. And if you tear in order to sew 2 stitches, you're also liable. Okay? So you sew 2 stitches, or no, that didn't really, this stitch is not very strong. Let me rip it open so that I can sew it again. And then you would also be liable. Now, that last move, the idea that even tearing, sewing, it constitutes a violation, but tearing in order to sew also constitutes a violation. That's a bit of a surprise. That's a little bit of a surprise. Now, why? What's the difference between sewing and tearing? Why would I think that sewing would be a violation of Shabbat, but tearing would not be a violation of Shabbat? It's sort of a funny question to open our discussion with. But what's the difference between sewing and tearing? The Mishnah is here to teach me that you can be liable for either sewing or ripping apart a stitch. But what's the difference, Payam?
Because if you talk about work is additive. So when you're sewing or weaving, it's an additive action. But when you're tearing, it's non-additive in that sense that you're not adding anything. You're just reconstituting.
Okay, thank you, Payam. So that's exactly right. The whole system of observing Shabbat is based on the notion, not that you don't do work. We often say shorthand, you got to rest on Shabbat. It's not really about resting. It's about not creating. That's what Shabbat is about, because Shabbat is a rest from creation, going back to the first Shabbat, God's Shabbat. So what we are not supposed to do on Shabbat is something constructive, something creative. That's what you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. So talk about core Jewish knowledge, right? If you leave the class now, That's a piece of core Jewish knowledge. It's not about relaxing. Shabbat is not about relaxing. It's about not creating, but simply being with what is. Okay, and then Payam says, so if you're sewing, you're building, creating, if you're weaving, you're creating something. You might think that if you're ripping something apart, that's not creative, that's destructive. So that's not a violation of Shabbat. But the Mishnah teaches that if you rip in order to sew, well, then that is a violation of Shabbat because your destruction serves a creative function. Sometimes you need to tear things down in order to build them back up. So destruction that is with the intention of creating, that is also a violation of Shabbat. Okay, all right. I was like, so much introduction here that we only now getting to the juicy piece. This Mishnah was the one that I was really excited to show you today. So take a look. Now we've got all the system set up. We have the 39 prohibited labors. 2 of them are sewing and weaving. Those are creative actions, so they're forbidden if you do 2 stitches or 2 threads. But it's also true that if you rip in order to sew more, that's also part of again, I'm curious, you tailors and knitters and sewers out there, if all of this sounds familiar to you. But that's that idea of ripping in order to start again. That's also a prohibited Shabbat action. Okay, now all of a sudden, and this is what I love about the Mishnah, is that you get that eat your vegetables knowledge, but then all of a sudden something comes up along the way that takes you in a different direction or in a tangent. So here's the very fascinating tangent we're going to look at today. One who tears in anger over his dead is exempt, as is anyone who acts merely destructively, right? V'chol hamakalkalin peturin. But one who destroys in order to repair is just as liable as someone who repairs. This second, we basically have covered this principle, right? Payam helped us understand, if you destroy in order to repair, just like if you tear in order to sew, you're liable. You violated Shabbat, because that's a creative act, okay? But, now this is the part that we're going to look at today. If you tear because you're angry, and really I think the anger here is also anguish, because somebody died. And it's not just somebody, it's over his dead. So somebody died. If you are experiencing some kind of painful shock like that, and you start ripping things apart, then you're not breaking Shabbat. You're not breaking Shabbat. You're smashing things, you're tearing things. In this case, you're ripping your garment. I can't believe it. You're exempt. Now, why? Why are you exempt there? Let's speak that out a little bit. Why are you exempt if you hear that someone you love dies and you tear your shirt open out of anguish, anger? Why? Maybe this is too much of a gotcha question, right? Emily?
Well, is it because you're responding to what is, but you're not creating what does not exist? Right. That's right. This is not an action which is done in order to, like, I'm not ripping my garment and then I'll get a better sew on it later. All right. There's no intention of creation in this act, which in a different context would be forbidden, but you just had an emotional reaction, right? You heard something, you just responded. And that's not a creative action. That's an emotional response, which led to a physical action. That's not a violation of Shabbat. Okay? We might think about what is that, what category it is, but that doesn't fall into the category, because it seems a violation of Shabbat has to include some intention to create, to build, right? And this kind of destruction is just an expression of anger, of grief, of sadness, of whatever it is, and that's not a violation of Shabbat. All right, so already kind of a fascinating
principle, and I would ask you to think about whether it makes sense to you, whether you would affirm this principle. Is this a good law that your actions that are the consequence of an emotional response are not liable? They are not considered violations of Shabbat. Okay, Derek. Nope.
Thanks. It took me a while to get to my unmute. I think it is a good law because I think it's like a crime de passion, like in France, like but it's a much worse example, obviously, where you kill your spouse out of passion, you're exempt. And I think there's a similar, obviously there's a lot of feminist pushback against that law because it's usually a man doing it to a woman. Sorry to raise that, but it's a similar principle that when you're full of emotion, there is no intention, there's no thought. It's not like, and when you're robbed of thought, and it's a justifiable action. It's not like someone died in your family and you went and killed somebody else. So actually my analogy is not exactly right, that then that's okay. But you're doing something that's understandable. It's actually part of an older tradition, like rending your garments is all over the place in the Bible, right? When you're feeling sorrow. So it's also, there's this biblical kind of echo that says like, this is what you do when you're feeling low about someone lost, So I think it's this notion that it's not intentional, it is traditional, and there's a biblical record of that.
Okay, good. So we're learning now something about Shabbat, which is that Shabbat the practice of Shabbat or the violation of Shabbat requires intentionality. Right? That there's something about it's not just the act itself, which you might have thought. You might have thought like, oops, this action was performed in the world. That's all there is to it. But the intentionality is relevant here. And we're also learning something about our emotional lives, which is at least how the rabbis saw our emotional lives, which is that, the passions the rabbis saw them as things that were separate from intentionality, things that just emerged from within, and one didn't have control over one's emotional response. And this seems like maybe a simplistic thing to say, but not everybody actually is going to agree with it. So let's just take note that so far what we have here is that Shabbat requires a kind of a present state of mind in order to keep, but even in order to violate, and that our emotional life is not considered a present state of a thoughtful state of mind, but a kind of unpredictable, stormy, reactive state. Now, then Derek said something interesting, which is that rending one's garments is one of the hallmark, one of the ancient mourning rituals. Now, that's interesting because that's exactly where the Talmud goes with this. So now that we have the principle in play, which is that if you are reacting out of anger or out of anguish again, then you can't be violating Shabbat, because Shabbat requires you to do something constructive, creative, intentional. Okay. But the Mishnah says, wait a minute. Is someone who hears about a dead person and then tears their garment, is that person just reacting? Is that an emotional response that they couldn't control? Or was that in itself a creative act? Okay, so let's take a look here at where the Talmud goes. We're going to look at two debates in the Talmud, two ways of problematizing what we've just learned. And here's the first one. The Talmud says, now, I told you earlier that there's two parts to the Talmud. One part is the Mishnah, and the second part is what they call the Gemara, which is the commentary on the Mishnah. Together, they make up the Talmud. So this Gemara picks up right where at the end of this Mishnah here, and it introduces a problem. Wait a minute. You just told me that if I'm angry and I rip my clothes, that doesn't constitute a violation of Shabbat because it's just destructive. It's just destructive. Okay, but wait a minute. I've also been taught a different law. Okay, here's a record of a different teaching, which is that one who tears in his anger, in his mourning over his dead, is liable. is liable. Now, that seems like a direct contradiction, although take note that some of the wording is different. This in his mourning did not appear in this teaching. So one who tears in anger over his dead is exempt, but one who tears in anger in his mourning over his dead is liable. Why? Because even though he desecrates Shabbat, even though this act is a violation of Shabbat, it is the fulfillment of a different obligation, which is the one that Derek was just mentioning. There's a tradition to tear your clothes when you're in mourning. There's a tradition. So the person who rips their clothes isn't just reacting emotionally, they are following the tradition of mourning. And since they're following the tradition of mourning, they are fulfilling their obligation to mourn, which means that it is a constructive act, which means that it is a violation of Shabbat. Okay, does that make sense? It's a sort of it's a screwy logic there, but because ripping your garment fulfills a mourning rite and practice, well, that's not an irrational, emotional, reactive. That fulfills a particular practice. And so the Mishnah resolves by saying, oh, our case must be referring to someone who is not obligated to mourn. Okay. Now, what does that mean? There are certain people, family relationships that Jewish law mandates that we mourn: our parents, our siblings, our spouses, our children. Those are the people that we traditionally say Kaddish for. But I'm not obligated to go through the mourning rites and rituals if I lose a friend. I'm not obligated in the same way. But what the Mishnah then says is, okay, so if you lose one of the obligated family relationships and you tear your garment, you've done something constructive, you have fulfilled that obligation, that would be a violation of Shabbat. But if you lose a friend and you just react, well, that's not a violation of Shabbat because that was just an emotional, you didn't have to tear your garment, you just did out of an emotional response, okay? Okay, now, how do we make sense of this? Does this, I guess my only way through this strange conversation is to keep asking, does this law make sense to you? I asked earlier, does it make sense to exempt someone from a violation of Shabbat if they have an emotional reaction? And Derek at least said, yeah, that's a good law. That's a crime of passion. But now the Talmud wants to suggest, yeah, but if you are a mourner going through mourning rites, then that's a formal tearing, and you should wait until Shabbat is over to do it. In fact, if you don't, then you violated Shabbat. But if you just have a crime of passion, not a crime of passion, but just a reaction of passion, then that constitutes a violation of Shabbat. Okay, so let's see whether what we think about this. Is this a good law, Rachel Katz?
Oh, I mean, I just think it's weird given that fulfilling a commandment is now considered like a constructive act. It would also seem, if the logic is that you're only exempted when it's by virtue of passion, then like you can't have, I'm not saying this well, but then fulfilling a commandment somehow is like separated off from the domain of passion, which makes no sense. So I don't know. I'm just very confused.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Like, can we really divide our actions into rational, constructive, intentional acts, and then those that are just driven by emotion? I mean, don't we do a lot of don't we carry out a lot of our religious practices out of emotion, especially mourning practices? It doesn't really, what does it make, just because you're obligated to tear your garments, now that's not an emotional reaction? And yet that seems to be what the Talmud is suggesting to us, that there's a difference between formal mourning and just emotional response. And Rachel says, I'm not so sure that it makes sense to divide between the passions and the rational practice of our mourning above of all things, right? Okay, all right. Let's take one more thought on this, and then we'll move to this last debate before we close. Florine Rosen.
I don't know where my question fits, If one should pass away and not have any family, and one asks one's rabbi to rend his or her garments, where does that fall?
Wait, say that again. Someone passes away.
And you have no family or anyone in Judaism who practices Judaism. And one asks a relative, not relative, a good friend or a rabbi to rend your garment, his or her garment. Where does that fit?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, can we take on an obligation that we don't have to begin with? Can someone say, I will be obligated to mourn in your place? There's some debate over whether that is possible. But I think, just to use your example, if someone dies and they have no immediate family members, then there's no one who's technically obligated to go through the rites of mourning. And so anyone who did mourn them would be considered to be doing it out of emotional response, right? And therefore, in this case, they would not be violating Shabbat. But the question of whether or not they're violating Shabbat at this point almost feels like incidental. Like that already doesn't feel like the most important question. What feels like the most important question here is whether or not there's some kind of important difference between an uncontrolled emotional response and then a formalized emotional response or a formalized mourning response. Is there some difference between the two? Okay, I see I'm running out of time here. And this it's our first class, so we had to take a big running start here. But before we close, I want to show you, you see now how strange these debates can get. This sort of question of whether we're violating Shabbat, depending on whether or not we were obligated to have this response, or it was just an emotional response. That's the kind of question that we're asking. In order to ask the question about violating Shabbat, we have to do a deep investigation over what it means to mourn, to feel anger, to feel anguish. Okay, but here is another debate that comes up in the Talmud that brings us to yet another question of what it means to have an emotional response. Okay, so take a look at this next debate. This will be the last thing we look at today. So Rabbi Avin says, okay, our case, meaning the one where someone is not obligated to mourn, they're just having that emotional response, is also constructive, because in tearing, he assuages his anger. Okay, so what's the point here? There is no such thing as an emotional response which is not constructive, because all emotional responses serve the function of dealing with your emotional state. So when you are angry and you cry out and you destroy something, that is a creative act. That is a constructive act. That is an act which has a purpose, because what you're doing is you're dealing with your anger. You are expressing your anger, and that helps you to calm down. Okay? What does that mean? That means it is a violation of Shabbat. It is a violation. I mean, I know it's a little silly to keep putting it back in the context of, well, did you violate Shabbat or not? But this is the way that the rabbis allow themselves to have this conversation. What does it mean to get angry, and what does it do for us? And one position is anger is good. It settles us. It's important to vent. It's important to express. It's important to have the emotional response, because you need that in order to settle your soul. And since it has a purpose and since it is constructive, well, then it's a violation of Shabbat. Okay, but I said it's a debate, and the other position in the Talmud is a famous statement in the Talmud. So we'll give the other side, and then we'll close by hearing what you think about. But the other side is this. Wait a minute, says the Talmud. Is it really permitted to get angry? Is it really permitted? Is it really a good thing to get angry to cool your emotional state? Wasn't it taught that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Chilfa bar Agra, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, long chain of attribution here, one who rends his garments in anger, or who breaks his vessels in anger, or who scatters his money in anger, should be like an idol worshiper in your eyes, as that is the craft of the evil inclination. Today it tells him to do this, and tomorrow it tells him to do that, until eventually, when he no longer controls himself, it tells him to worship idols, and he goes and worships idols. Okay. In other words, says this long string of rabbis, anger is never an appropriate response, because if you let yourself go into anger, soon you will be totally out of control. Soon you'll be worshiping idols. If you indulge your anger, you're just that much closer to being completely off the rails. Every expression of anger is dangerous and should be controlled. And then I'll say the funny last thought, which is that, and therefore, if you do engage in anger, you are not violating Shabbat, because there's nothing good or constructive or intentional about anger. It's always dangerous. It's always just a step away from idol worship, because anger takes over you and controls you. So now, and we just have a minute left. Now, the last question is, what do you think about this debate? Is anger a constructive and important way for people to deal with their emotions? Or is anger always a dangerous, out of control state that should be regulated? Okay, so let's see if we can get a couple last thoughts in. Matt Silberstein.
That's a real question, because anger is a starting thing.
I can't wait. We're not hearing you, Matt. Your sound is not. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm muting you, Matt, because we can't hear you. There's something about your sound's not working. Leah Matsui, we'll give you the last thought.
For me, this whole discussion has been really moving, because it communicates the compassion of the rabbis for us. There's a lot of anger in the Tanakh, and we see also Hashem being compassionate to us when we are angry. I don't see it as constructive, anger as constructive or destructive. It depends on if we have a compassionate listener with us in our anger. That's the container that I think that we need. It's not a good place to go alone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So that's a good thought to close with, which is that there's in this discussion, which sort of comes up in the strain, sort of along the way, as they're trying to figure out what it means to keep Shabbat, what it means to intentionally keep Shabbat, what it means to intentionally create or construct. Along the way, as we think about intentionality, as we think about deliberate behavior, the rabbis start wondering, what about those parts of ourselves that are difficult to control? What do we do with our emotional responses? Are we responsible for them or not? And we have not gotten to any conclusion here, but as Leah says, it is heartening, I think, to see the rabbis at least trying to consider that, at least trying to acknowledge that we're not always in our right minds. We're not always in control. And we have to think about what are the implications of those extreme and difficult emotional states for our religious lives. Are we responsible? Is part of our religious lives to manage those states, to not indulge in those states? Or is it the case that sometimes we simply have to be forgiven because we're in such a state of shock, such a state of rage, such a state of sadness that we can't be held accountable? We can't be held. Those are difficult questions, but the questions that the rabbis are sensitive enough, even while they're moving through their kind of nitpicky analysis of the 39 laws of Shabbat, something comes up and the rabbis say, hold on, stop everything. Let's talk about what anger is and what we do with it. So that's the kind of discussion that you'll find in the Mishnah. That kind of that very nitpicky, intricate analysis of our tradition and its laws, but along the way, a serious consideration of not just what is a cup or what is a stitch or what is Shabbat, but also what is anger and what is going on inside of us. Who are we? So come back next week as we begin this, we pick up once again this journey through the rabbis' ontology, through their attempt to map out an entire world around them and also to map out the world of the soul inside. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you
Thank you.
all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.